Hello, everyone. This is Dalton and Jack of Analyze and Optimize. We are here doing, I think, our second, or I don't know how many times we've done this, but not very frequently. I had a podcast format, but we decided to do it now for two very special guests who I think at this point probably need no introduction, but I'll let them have the floor and introduce themselves anyway.
Hi, I'm Georgie. Glad to be on the podcast. I typically do one of these. We used to do it every week with Roddy, who is also here. But yeah, basically, if I'm of any fame, it's probably from his podcast and posting on the Repeat forum. And that's pretty much me, an independent health researcher.
My name is Roddy, and if anybody knows who I am, it's probably because of Georgi Dinkov over there being a Bulgarian wizard, and that's why people know who I am.
All right, beautiful. So I think a lot of our viewers at this point should be familiar with the sort of bioenergetic paradigm. So I don't want to bore people with, energy, stress, and thyroid and talking about all that stuff. I kind of want to ask you guys both about things that you've been up to recently. So we could start with Georgie. So you did a little talk with Tucker Goodrich, who's a low carb proponent from my perspective on David Granovsky's show. So you want to maybe just give us your sort of synopsis and maybe why you guys ended up disagreeing about the role of carbohydrates in the diet?
I think towards the end we kind of ended up agreeing. I think that the big disagreement was Tucker thought that if you have health problems, so if you carry extra weight, he thinks that low carbing and of course cutting PUFA out as much as possible is the way to go, because he thinks basically all of this PUFA that is in your stores, you need to get rid of it as quickly as possible. And at least the things that I mentioned, the studies that I referenced, that increased lipolysis, especially of polyunsaturated fat, is responsible for a lot of the damage that we see, organ damage in conditions like diabetes. There are multiple studies showing basically that PUFA gets preferentially released from the fat stores during time of elevated stress, fasting, low carb, and whatnot. And I think Tucker basically says that's not a problem. I mean, that's you need to oxidize the fat in order to get rid of it. And I'm more in race camp because I've seen the damage of what excess lipolysis can do to people like me, including. And I thought that basically like the race approach, which is support the liver, support the thyroid, there's always some baseline lipolysis going on. You don't want to increase it anymore, right? Because whatever you increase over baseline, it's going to be mostly PUFA. And you don't want more PUFA floating into your bloodstream because first of all, it's going to overburden the liver. It will probably cause some liver damage. Then second, whatever the liver cannot process through glucuronidation and possibly sulfation as well to make it more like water soluble so you can pee it out, then it's going to get redistributed back to the tissues, and basically you'll go to your brain, you'll go to your heart, you'll go to many other organs, and that's something Ray said as well. That's really what's responsible for the long-term fibrotic processes that we're seeing in a lot of people that ultimately lead to cancer. If any fibrosis is basically the precursor to cancer. And Tucker was at least, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think he was saying is that that's not a problem. Let's get rid of the PUFA as quickly as possible. And then once you get rid of the PUFA, then you can basically go back to eating carbs as much as you want. But he still was saying that for him, he thought that low carb is the way to go. He's like, yeah, I don't have a problem with high carb, but you shouldn't be eating it while you're sick and or overweight, because you're not going to be able to lose the weight and it's going to stay as PUFA. I personally disagree with that, because even if you overdo it on the carbs, first of all, the carbs are going to keep lipolysis from rising, into the excessive range due to the insulin that the insulin release they trigger. Second, if any fats are being synthesized from carbs, it's going to be saturated fat, palmitic acid, right? Which, if it gets stored into your tissues, it'll change the balance of the fatty tissue more towards the saturated fat, which also matters because fatty tissue can actually get inflamed. There could be localized inflammation. And now medicine is finding out that a lot of this so-called peripheral insulin resistance is actually due to localized inflammation inside of the fatty cells. Well, most of that inflammation is actually driven by the PUFA metabolites, the prostaglandins and the leukotrienes. So the less PUFA you have in those cells there, the better, right? Tucker is saying get it all out as quickly as possible, and then everything will go back to normal. I have seen myself that's at least for me, it did not work that way. In fact, when I pushed myself to increase lipolysis to lose weight, all hell break loose. I started getting floaters in my eyes. Basically, my blood sugar jumped over 100, which really worried my doctor. I started getting these lipofuscin, spots, which are now gone, and I can show my hands pretty closely. But I used to have them here on the hands. So really lipolysis, everything that Ray said, in my case, was confirmed. So I went back to niacinamide, basically the high carb diet, low fat. I couldn't do zero fat, which is I mentioned on Tucker's show. I just craved fat way too much. I was prone to wake up in the middle of the night and eat 2 pints of ice cream, which obviously is maybe healthy but not optimal. So basically, the way I lost my extra weight, a lot of the weight that I carry right now, I would like to say it's muscle, is basically by going down to about 15% of total daily calories for fat. So I still am in the camp, mostly Ray's camp, that basically if you're struggling, if you have health problems, and even if you're overweight, I would not basically go through a low carb period where you're trying to burn all of this extra fat as quickly as possible. Fat oxidation should be kept down to a minimum at rest, when basically at rest your muscles will prefer to burn mostly fat. So this means you should be struggling. You should basically, your focus should be building up muscle mass, because that's what's going to help you to actually truly burn off this fat in the safest manner possible. Not by exerting yourself and raising the lipolysis. And of course, in order to exert yourself, cortisol and adrenaline will have to rise, and the entire cascade basically starts from there, and you'll be in a chronic inflammatory state. Whether that will really damage your health. If you let's say if you're doing this for like a couple of weeks to lose weight, but if you're severely overweight, it's going to be more than a couple of weeks, even through Tucker's method, and I think this is very dangerous.
But Georgi, that's what we would have been doing throughout our evolution.
Well, here's the thing. Just as I mentioned on Twitter, I am always wary of the when you say evolutionary and then add a scientific discipline. There's evolutionary psychology, there's evolutionary psychiatry, evolutionary dietology, right? It's very easy to come up with a hypothesis that makes sense from an evolutionary point of view, right? The problem is that all of these evolutionaries, fill in the dots, fill in the blank, they're untestable. It's not really a scientific hypothesis. We cannot recreate evolution in the lab at that speed, at that level, to basically see first how changing a diet will affect the genome, and second, whether a specific diet is optimal for our genome or not, right? In order to be able to do that, we have to basically do gene editing. Maybe now with the CRISPR techniques coming into wide use, maybe we'll be able to do some of that, but I don't think so. The way things are going, I don't know if you saw the results, some of the first CRISPR trials, the animals died very quickly when they edited just a few of their genes. So I'm not exactly holding my breath to see what's going to happen. Actually, it's kind of terrifying, because at this point, they're proposing to start using on humans soon. And because of the pandemic, they removed most of the restrictions and most of the requirements really for safety. Now, basically, any pharmaceutical company can come up with an mRNA product, or, I don't want to call it a vaccine because it's not a vaccine, and say, hey, look, we tested on 2 rats. That's perfectly safe. Let's go and start using on people. So the real clinical trial now is basically directly on us, the customers. So we are paying for them to test stuff on us. Anyways, the evolutionary argument for this or that diet is very difficult to defend, because I've looked at the studies. If you look at different populations in different parts of the world, you will find out they consume a different diet, right? Basically, the Eskimos, if you look at some of their ancestors, you're probably going to find that they consume mostly blubber, actually, because these polar animals, they don't carry around much meat. It's mostly fat to keep them warm, right? Then if you look at somebody who lived in the tropical areas, such as I think Ray has an article about the Boskop skull, which was in Kenya, right? And if you look at the ancestral diet and basically the excavations that have been done there, you will see that most of these pre-hominid creatures were actually consuming tropical fruits, meat, fish, stuff like that. But this is, the composition of the diet is very different compared to what the Eskimos were eating, or what some of the steppe people in Central Asia were eating. It really depends on the local environment. So I don't know of a study that definitively says all of our ancestors for millions of years ate X, right? It's this group ate this, that group ate that, and that's how it was, basically, based on the geographical area where these people are located. So 2 things. Hard to make a testable argument from an evolutionary perspective, right? And also the evidence that we have so far, even though it's inconclusive, it's not basically it's not uniform. It doesn't point into a single direction. To me, it basically says that the group ate whatever was available in this locality. Some of them were herders, others were doing primitive agriculture, and then still others in the tropical regions. They basically were eating ripe fruit and whatever animals were running around them. But from the biochemical point of view, there's little doubt that a diet high in carbohydrates, maybe up to 20% fat, and then the rest protein, is actually pretty good, at least from a cardiovascular perspective. If you listen to the Tucker Goodrich, I brought up the Tsimane tribe, which is in the Amazon. They eat 80 to 90%, 80 to 90% carbs daily. And then whatever little is left after that is basically protein. So they're on a very low fat, high carb, I would say low to moderate protein diet, and have zero incidence of cardiovascular disease. Now they do still have these plaques and some calcification of the blood vessels, but they don't develop actual cardiovascular events. So this kind of points towards yet another example that maybe the theories that are being pushed here in the West, that these are actually biomarkers of cardiovascular disease. Maybe that's not true. Maybe it is something adaptive that happens with age, right? And this calcification. I mean, in high amounts, it's not good because the vessel cannot dilate as needed. But the Tsimane, in their 60s and above, they do have calcification in their blood vessels, yet they don't die of heart attacks and strokes. But the diet that they eat, I would say, is very much Petarian. Probably the only non-Petarian thing there is that most of the carbs are in the form of starch. I think they eat sweet potatoes, and they don't eat grains. Sweet potatoes and tapioca and some other tropical plants that are high starch. But basically that's it. High carb, low fat diet, which is what Petarianism seems to be focusing on.
Yeah. Danny, I definitely want to get your perspective here as well, because I think it was you that sort of brought to my attention that even if, we were eating 3 pounds of ribeye every day during our evolution, which is, as Georgie just elucidated, is doubtful, if not unverifiable, does it even matter because we don't live a million years ago?
We can edit this out. It's like dropping every 15 or 30 seconds for me, and now I can't even see or hear Georgie.
I'm here.
It's really bizarre.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, that has been a perennial argument. I mean, at least for the last, 5 years or so. Even if we perfectly knew what paleo man ate, would it even be useful to apply that to our current situation where we're all having this conversation, we're all being irradiated by cell phone towers and dealing with new levels of pollution and a culture that none of us really asked to be a part of, that seems to be manipulated in an incalculable number of ways. And so I was just starting to get more thinking that idea was more and more dubious over time, that it was even that it was a useful heuristic to start looking at health from. And so that's why I was so attracted to Ray, of thinking about physiology first and trying to understand how the body worked and approaching it from that lens, rather than thinking about trying to think about what paleo man ate, and even if it was useful, which I really don't think it is. But again, 10 years ago, I don't think that was very compelling. But these days, I think a lot more people are coming around to that
Danny,
idea being more useful. And just like the proliferation of the carrot salad on Twitter or something, it's like a person just has to get a little nudge in the right direction or affect their bowels, and then they might have questions about serotonin or endotoxin or how those interact with cortisol or the adrenals or whatever, and how it makes them feel better. And so it's just it's so much more useful than just this fantasy of trying to mimic what our ancestors ate. And so, but I think a lot less people are, I think more people are coming around to the idea that it's not that useful.
All right, cool. So major technical difficulties there for a second, but we're back. So honestly, I don't even remember what we were talking about, so we can just dive into
the paleo point. The paleo that Dennis said that it's not really, may not be relevant for nowadays, even if they did eat what the paleo people are claiming that the paleo people ate back in the day.
Yeah. So this is something that the low carb crowd likes to emphasize, is that you need to burn more fat. But for everything I'm reading, it seems like people that are under stress and people that are sick are actually already burning more fat than a healthy person would be. So what's your take on that?
I mean, you can measure that, and you can see there's this biomarker they call the respiratory quotient, and if it's over 1, you're burning mostly carbs. If it's below 1, you're burning mostly fat. And there are multiple studies. Anytime they try it on a like a randomly selected hospital population, the ROQ is always under 1 for the vast majority of people. Now, of course, you can say, well, these are sick people, right? They're in the hospital, so it's kind of expected they'll be under stress. But I can send you studies of quote unquote healthy, or at least non-hospitalized people selected, and for metabolic studies, and majority of them have an ROQ less than 1, which the doctors are thrilled about. They said, excellent, these people are burning all this fat, they'll be awesome. Yet these people are pre-diabetic or diabetic or have some other chronic degenerative condition.
Yeah, that is so not controversial, that in extreme stress or driving a race car or jumping out of an airplane or becoming ill, you liberate more fat into the blood and you become a fat burning beast, in the words of Mark Sisson. And so it was, finding that out was extremely revelatory. I was like, how come we're being told to burn fat when it's like synonymous with the state of stress and illness and death? It started to make a lot more sense after learning that fact.
Well, it only makes sense in the culture because the culture promotes stress, right? I've spoken to multiple doctors who said, of course, stress is good for you. It just, doesn't have to be chronic. I said, how do you measure when it becomes chronic and, when it's acute? Well, if it's a couple of hours every day, I'm like, well, that's already chronic. It's happening every day. How do you know that 1 hour of stress is, let's say beneficial, but 2 hours of stress is harmful? Well, you're asking way too much. You're making too much sense. Shut up and take your pills and go away.
Yeah, I guess a big part of it is that, and I would love to hear your guys' take on this, but we're constantly being told to reject what our bodies tell us. So it's don't listen to your cravings. If you're tired, you have to push through it. It's normal to be bloated or constipated. It's just all these things that are contrary to what evolution, if you will, has instilled in us to recognize these things, right? So you would normally be able to tell if a stress is beneficial. If you go to the gym, you could tell when it's enough, right? And you stop, right, and you recover and you go from there. But it seems like that sort of nuance is gone. So that's actually a good point, because this is another, I guess, common talking point, is things like the sauna and things like eating raw vegetables with carcinogens in them, or whatever the proposed hormetic effect is. What's your take on this whole idea of hormesis?
Well, I mean, does it remind you this thing of not trusting yourself but trusting something else? Does it remind you of something? The entire culture is built that way, right? You should stay in your lane, and apparently even you yourself are not your lane. That's the doctor's lane. And you cannot make any decisions or make any kind of judgments about your own health. There was an old study, I posted it, I think it was back in 2016, showing that how you actually feel, when you go to the doctor and whether you feel fine or not, was much more predictive for long-term mortality and morbidity than what the test that your doctor would do, on average speaking, right? So you go to the doctor and say, hey, I feel like crap. The doctor, does some biomarkers, et cetera. And it's oh, nothing's wrong with you. Everything comes back fine, right? But, the person who was not feeling fine, and then when they did some more extensive studies, they found out that the free fatty acids were elevated. A lot of these people had reactivation of viruses, dormant viruses, especially the herpes family and things like that. And then conversely, people that basically said that they're feeling just fine, the doctor said, oh, your cholesterol is high, your blood sugar is high, et cetera, et cetera. Yet these people did fine over the course of the study, which was multiple years. They follow up on these people. So for whatever reason, medicine basically says that, the things that you experience, which is symptoms, are less important than the science, which is the stuff that can be, ascertained externally by the doctor. And your symptoms are just anecdotal, they're psychosomatic, they're whatever they are, but the doctor may give you 10 minutes of his or her time to listen to you, but mostly reject whatever it is that you're sharing. And then the rest of the stuff is just, they claim objective biomarker assessment. And if the biomarkers are coming back fine, then if you're still complaining, the doctor will invariably send you to the shrink. I've had multiple people report this to me. I almost got to that point basically when I was telling the doctor that I wasn't feeling okay. But yeah, anyway, so it's really, the culture is such that, even the most intimate things to you, which is like how you feel about yourself and your day-to-day health, are basically taken away from you. And you're being told it's what you see does not matter. What you experience does not matter. It's what we think is what matters. And there's a famous line, I think it's towards the end of the 1984 book by George Orwell. It was the final command of the party, because, people saying he wrote it about the Communist Party. The final command of the party was that reality does not matter. It's only what we say, something along those lines.
Yeah, the whole idea of stealing the center from the person and sacrificing them to expert culture. It's kind of like a lot of people growing up in the low carb scene, people were always trying to lose their appetite and negate their desire for sweetness and stuff like that. And now when I think about it, it's probably similar to saying, like, do you have to go to the bathroom? Okay, just hold it as long as possible. Like, it makes like absolutely no sense. Yeah. And one of the newsletters that I really appreciate that Ray Pete had written was I think it's called Biological Addiction and Balance. And it's talking about how the organism is always seeking balance. And so if somebody is radically like drawn to eating chocolate, or this could even extend into drugs like cocaine or something, that almost any of those things have therapeutic value to some extent. And so the organism is always seeking balance, even if that thing could be harmful, like alcohol or something like that. And like we've talked about alcohol having anti-stress effects many times. And so this is much more useful than this heathen aspect of like, a person's messed up mentality, and they need to, like, in a religious sense of like trying to purge their urges or desires and things like that, which is extremely unhelpful, I think.
Yeah, I think. Wait, Jack, you're muted.
I mean, even with you guys, like, I feel like when I watch you, like, I'm not gonna name names, but like a lot of low carb people versus like watching you guys, it's just like you seem like normal, like, chill people. You're not like uptight at all. But then like you'll see some of these other guys that are just like, you could tell they're just like gritting their teeth, like even if they're not talking like it.
You can't even finish a sentence, they'll immediately attack you. Like the moment you open your mouth, they already have like things to oppose you with, right? The Will and Blake, the negation. They're ready to like negate you even while you're breathing. You haven't even said anything, but you're already irritating them, and they're trying to come up with something to shut you down. And if they do shut you down, they're like, that's victory, right? It's always about some kind of a fight. It's like I have to win this. It's not about, I know it may sound, I don't know, idealistic, but like the whole idea is that to increase the mutual information and common knowledge, right? That's what it's all about. If it's about winning, I don't know, I'll go in a boxing ring, or like do a competition about something. But this is what this has become. The mantra that truth is born out of like this clash, right? But there is some truth to it, because basically they've shown that people come up with better arguments when challenged. But this is degenerate to the point where it's not about forming good arguments. It's about one person completely dominating and crushing the other. And this apparently has the effect of being truthful, right? So if I am a really good arguer and I basically decimate somebody in an argument, then I may be speaking complete nonsense. But the fact that I'm assertive and I managed to actually crush the opponent, that's puro. That's great in Western culture, including when it comes to health. And it's really, nothing can be further from the truth. Nobody knows, has the complete truth about how to achieve optimal health. That's why it's so important to listen to your organism, because that's it's your health. It's not the doctor's health. So of course the doctor may have some like an external perspective, but it should always be like a team, right? You be working with your doctor. And even though the ads for drugs usually say work with your doctor, talk to your doctor, etc., in reality, what it comes down to is you sit down and listen, and the doctor gives you the orders, and that's what they call doctor's orders. And then you go about fulfilling them. That's not how this works. Even if the doctor is well-meaning, multiple studies have shown that servility in a patient is actually correlated with poorer long-term health outcomes. It's the patients that are patients from hell, so-called, the doctors hate them, that are questioning, that are arguing, that are saying, of course, I'm not saying that all of them are good patients, that this is how you should behave, but on average, people who question their doctor tend to have better long-term health outcomes, which shows you that at the very least, their own opinion about themselves is apparently better than the medical opinion because they tend to fare better.
To tag on to what Jack said, it's funny when you get to a state of relaxation, or if you've experienced that, how you can identify how unrelaxed a lot of other people are. And so it's interesting to scan the health world and to notice how few people actually have contact with anything that resembles health whatsoever. And so it's and again, that not to keep praising Ray, but I thought him tackling callers on KMUD was always interesting. You'd have some irate, crazy person talking about SSRIs, and Ray would always be cool as a cucumber, and I always admired that about him. And yeah, it's just it's like a boxing match for everything, and it's about domination and smearing your opponent, and not even demonstrating that you understand what they're saying. I don't think I've ever seen like a steel man of the bioenergetic approach before trying to take it down. I've only seen like kind of low IQ takedowns of it, but like it didn't seem like they understood what they were talking about at all.
I mean, when I try to engage over Twitter with two people that, one of them was this Dr. Avi Bitterman about the vaccines. First, I started quoting some studies on Twitter and then immediately said, I'm not going to do this over Twitter. If you want to talk to me, come and talk to me over Discord. So I did. And guess what? He basically immediately shut me down and said, I'm the doctor, basically I don't care about your own professional opinion. To which I responded, and why he invited me to Discord to start with. And is that how we're going to be discussing? He said, you need to show me more respect. I've studied way more than you have. And I have never said anything other than, okay, so here are the studies. You wanted me to talk to you on Discord. What do you want me to do? And he basically came back saying like, no, that's not how you talk to a doctor. So let me unload all of this crap on you, and basically 90% of it was berating me. How basically all these studies that I found, they're all wrong. But it was somehow my fault for finding them. It's not that the studies was wrong or anything. He just refused to acknowledge it because I found it. So it was Georgie finding the study that was the problem that needed to be tackled. Not whether the vaccine can incorporate into DNA. Not whether basically all these vaccines are causing long-term health effects. He refused to even debate that. He said, I cannot discuss this with a person that is not of my rank. And another person who again made a mistake. Some people on Twitter said, why don't you try to engage with them about PUFA? Somebody did a takedown of the anti-omega-6 movement. I don't know if you've seen, he wrote a blog post of 4 or 5 points. And I just took one of them basically this talked about the inflammation, right? And then I posted quotes directly from studies saying that 80% of the inflammatory response is as a result of the prostaglandins and leukotrienes. And I said, by definition, this means omega-6 are inflammatory. So to which he responded with this picture of a clown. And basically that was the argument.
Classic.
Basically, and other people basically said, look, is that how you, to that person, is that how you debate? We thought that you're going to say you have something to respond with. Then he sent another picture of a clown. So, I mean, that's really what the health debate currently, or in general, the debate in the public sphere has degenerated into. It's somebody has, hurt feelings for whatever reason, and then their job is to cancel you. That's it. If they don't cancel you, they consider themselves canceled, or at least failures, right? And then they somehow lose the respect of the community. I just, to me, this is unconscionable. I don't even understand what is this community out there that I have to earn the respect of. Who are these people? But yeah.
I remember that interaction going down, and I think you said on one of the podcasts, you were like an angry vegan doctor with the last name Bitterman. It's just too funny to almost even comprehend. But be that as it may, we don't have to keep going into them, but I think it's a good segue because this is something that I tweeted the other day, and it's kind of a good segue into the talk about serotonin. We obviously made a video about it a little over a year ago, and I've learned so much more about serotonin since then. But the main behavioral thing that I noticed when lowering my serotonin through various different means was the high serotonin state to me felt like the world was a threat. Mm-hmm. Whereas the low serotonin state feels like the world is an extension of the person, and things are opportunities and not threats. Someone challenges you and you look at that as this is a great opportunity to learn something and possibly make a connection here, as opposed to this person is threatening my identity. And even something as simple as going outside. I remember like I would get what you guys have referred to this before as like the tunnel vision that is sort of seen with the high serotonin state. Like I remember like going outside on a sunny day and being like, oh my God, like this is like not comfortable. And it was like the complete opposite of that. So
everything is irritating when you're in a high serotonin state.
Exactly. And I guess the irritation of the personality often coincides with the irritation of the gut, which is where a lot of the serotonin stems from. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, vast majority of it, studies say more than 90% is produced there. And it's mostly produced when there's irritation of the gastrointestinal tract. So by definition, I mean, the old name of serotonin was enteromin. Enteromin inside and usually related to the intestines. And it has been known since serotonin was discovered that basically serotonin is not released under optimal conditions. If there is a serotonin release, there's been either some kind of like a physical pressure or trauma or twisting of the intestine, or some kind of an irritant, which, got into the GI tract through the food or through the drink you're ingesting. So it's basically since serotonin goes always together with the histamine and nitric oxide, basically this triumvirate has been known since it has been discovered that it's not released when the conditions are optimal. It's the exact opposite. So very early in the science of serotonin, it was basically decided by the community just through experiments that the serotonin is actually a highly pathological entity, and they thought it was involved in most cancers because modern medicine will tell, it's only the carcinoid tumors that are in the GI tract that produce serotonin. That's what makes people nauseous. Well, if you talk to an oncologist, he'll tell you that most people with cancer actually are nauseous. So this means the serotonin is high in most cancer types, and the early studies on serotonin show that it's the primary pro-fibrotic substance in the body. And as I mentioned earlier, fibrosis always precedes cancer, at least the solid tumors, not the blood ones. So if serotonin causes fibrosis, you can easily make the step one step further and say serotonin ultimately will cause cancer if it's unopposed or at least released in these super optimal amounts. So then the question becomes, well, what is the physiological role of serotonin then? 90% of it is produced in the gut. Then I would argue that the role of serotonin is to speed intestinal transit when the body encounters something that's irritating and wants to get rid of it. That's really the only physiological function that's probably good, right? But if serotonin is chronically elevated, over time it will lead to inflammation of the intestine, the entire GI tract, and then this will actually decrease motility, intestinal transit. So now you'll have people with chronic constipation, and they will think that this is caused by low serotonin because medicine says, anything with high serotonin will give you diarrhea. Yeah, that's true, but only in cases where you basically have the carcinoid syndrome and you're producing 10 times the normal amount of serotonin. But in the still over suboptimal, in other words, elevated production of serotonin, which happens through eating suboptimal food, it doesn't even have to be toxic. If you're eating these resistant starches, if you eat anything that gets to the colon, so that the bacteria eats it, it produces endotoxin, which then irritates the intestine, start producing serotonin. That alone is enough over time to put you in a chronic constipating state. And basically, multiple studies have shown that if you administer they call them anti-prolactin drugs, because I think the studies that I've seen are with cabergoline and bromocriptine. These are actually anti-serotonin drugs as well. And prolactin and serotonin always go together, that these drugs are actually highly effective in relieving the IBS, the irritable bowel syndrome, with constipation. So it shows you that, yes, serotonin can cause both. I guess it depends really on the amount. If it's extremely high, yes, you'll probably get the diarrhea, which is what the people with carcinoid syndrome and many advanced cancers get. But if it's lower, but still suboptimal, in other words, elevated over time, you will probably get constipated. So all in all, serotonin's role, the physiological one, is first to get rid of toxins. Second, metabolically, it's actually a master metabolic regulator. It downregulates metabolism. And the latest study that I don't know if you saw on depression that came out that basically said that serotonin is really not the happy hormone, and we've been thinking about it wrong. And they making this pronouncement as if this is some kind of a new discovery. And they're saying its main role in the body is actually as a metabolic regulator, primarily in the brain, where it lowers oxidative phosphorylation by about 30%, 30. And that by itself should be enough for doctors to immediately recognize the role between high serotonin, the link between high serotonin and depression, because other studies have shown that if you lower ATP production in the brain, you can instantly cause depression. And if you lower it too much, you turn animals into violent homicidal machines. And you've probably seen the studies that I posted on the forum of basically that even low doses of SSRI drugs found into ambient water are capable of turning wildlife into cannibalistic, homicidal, basically creatures that lose all fear of even predators and sort of like start eating each other or even attacking the predators that they should be running away from. So all in all, serotonin is not associated with optimal health, and whatever physiological role it has is very limited, related mostly to digestion. And if it's chronically elevated, it will start affecting oxidative phosphorylation and ultimately, mood, right? Cognitive function, and then, over time may progress to the fibrotic diseases and ultimately cancer.
On top of that, it was like when I was first looking into serotonin, I don't even remember some like forum post, but it was someone that you would use SSRIs like for business recreationally. Like they wouldn't be on it for like months and months. It'd be like, oh, a week where I want to like get ahead of everybody, just be like vicious, like not have any empathy for anybody else. I just like use these to get on top, and I don't like myself when I do it, but it helps me in my business.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. I wish I could find I've looked through the post. I can't find it.
We have some messed up measures of success, don't we? Even in business. But guess what? Since almost everything these days is business, if that's what rules in business, it probably rules into every other industry as well, including medicine.
That's why it's so hard to like separate the culture from the health, because if you go with the idea that having low appetite is good, being cutthroat and aggressive all the time is good, and feeling threatened and being like pathologically competitive is a good thing, then yeah, you probably do want to elevate your serotonin. But I guess if you have a more level-headed approach, I'll say maybe that's not something that you necessarily want to increase. But this is a good another good segue into this idea about the microbiome. So I mean, a lot of people are promoting fermented foods and probiotics, prebiotics, and there's especially a stigma against antibiotics. Danny, I know this is something that you like to talk about a good amount, as well as the food antibiotics. So can you just sort of give us your perspective on that whole issue?
Yeah, so I guess it started when I was getting into Ray's stuff, and Ray was so like nonchalant about how helpful milk was, and I had basically heard just years of propaganda about how terrible it was. And even in 2011, I think I was at the Ancestral Health Symposium, and like 2 people gave anti-milk speeches about how what a terrible food it was. And so I obviously respected Ray, listening to him and starting to read his stuff, but I was like, man, he's like so confident that milk is such a good food, and I'm hearing that only raw milk is good, so I'll split the difference and just try the raw milk. And I just had like explosive diarrhea whenever I would include the raw milk. And so I didn't tolerate that. I tolerated the pasteurized milk a little bit better, and I tolerated the goat milk like significantly better than the pasteurized. But I was like, man, something's wrong with my gut. And I think I was listening to, must have been one of his early interviews, where he said milk maldigestion usually means there's like a bacterial overgrowth, or could mean there's a bacterial overgrowth in the intestine. And after veganism and vegetarianism and carnivore for years, I was like, there's a very real possibility that I have a bacterial overgrowth or something like that. And so one of my first emails to Ray was like, where do you get antibiotics? And he sent me a link to like my Mexican drugstore. I purchased them and I took penicillin, like VK, for probably like 2 weeks, and my milk allergy was like completely gone after that. And there was still a lot of work I had to do, but my gut was pretty messed up. But I was a believer after that, and I think it just emphasizes the role of like endotoxin and what's happening in like we were talking about serotonin, which goes hand in hand with endotoxin, and how important that is for just the integrity of the intestine. And the other thing I forgot to mention is I tolerated milk perfectly fine when I was younger. So there was something that changed in me when I was younger in my early 20s. And so I think since then I've been an evangelist for antibiotics. And for what it's worth, I talked to a lot of people, and the holy shit, come to Jesus, hallelujah moments that I receive from people are almost always people that take antibiotics. Like 9 out of 10 times, somebody will say, I took minocycline and it changed my life. or I took erythromycin and it changed my life. And just to be completely clear, I'm not recommending anything to anybody, but if somebody's going to explore or investigate antibiotics, there are legitimately dangerous ones. And so I think the penicillins, the macrolides, and the tetracyclines are the ones that I've investigated and seem to be safe. But and then of course I kind of glossed over the carrot salad and the well-cooked white button mushrooms and the bamboo shoots. But again, we talked about it maybe before the stream went down, but that.
Oh, are you guys still there?
Impact the intestine. You can lower the serotonin, lower the cortisol, lower the prolactin a little bit, and then maybe feel significantly better. Did I cut out?
Yeah, could you repeat that? Sorry.
Yeah, where did I cut out?
Right as you mentioned your previous cutout, it was kind of serendipitous.
Oh, okay, we were talking about
everything from scratch. Start from the beginning.
I think you were talking about you were about to bring up the carrots.
Okay, I think I was talking about the Twitter, like the carrot salad being a phenomenon on Twitter. You know, people incorporating it and feeling better. And again, I think that if a person's intestinal problems did not get significantly better with the carrot or the well-cooked white button mushrooms or something like the Mega Sporobiotic or something, I think they should investigate the penicillins or the macrolides or the tetracyclines. But again, I think this is just emphasizes how important the intestine is to a person's perception and their quality of life and things. But I know that's very controversial, and some people, even people that are into repeat, don't like when people talk about antibiotics. So I know it's a controversial subject.
Yeah, I guess the idea of a bacterial overgrowth in general is kind of frowned upon because you have people saying like, oh, but it's only but you need the good bacteria. And honestly, there's countless different species and whatnot in the gut. So it seems like a tall task, if not an impossible one, to sort of tease out what the balance of them that you want is. But from my perspective, it seems like too much is more of a common problem than too little. And it seems like the probiotics, the prebiotics, and those things are only beneficial insofar as they displace bacteria that is potentially worse. So it doesnn't seem to really add up. But do you guys have any thoughts on this idea of like beneficial bacteria? Or do you just want like a sterile colon, or is there a balance?
Have you seen that thread I have on the forum that no gut bacteria is beneficial, should be regulated as drugs? I think it was like maybe 2 years ago. Yeah. So if you look at that study, they actually said directly there, and they found out there is no such thing as a good bacteria when it comes to cancer. So specifically, I think they tested for liver and pancreatic cancer, all of this bacteria, no matter which one they tried. The L. reuteri, the lactobacillus, all of these strains were actually they promoted the growth of cancer, and invariably the antibiotics inhibited it. And I think in the case of the liver cancer, made it completely disappear. So as far as cancer is concerned, which we can consider, and even medicine agrees that it's a chronic inflammatory disorder. So as far as inflammation is concerned, there is no good bacteria. But if all chronic diseases are inflammatory in origin, then really there is no truly beneficial bacteria. Aside from that, multiple studies have shown that if you drastically inhibit, if not sterilize completely the colon, you cannot get fat. Like the animals are put on these hypercaloric diets, even on high fat. And when their guts are sterile, they do not get fat. They stay lean and extremely hungry. And when they measure their metabolic rate, it's basically has quadrupled. So I don't know what benefit. I guess I think medicine loves it, the current state of affairs, because it's so complicated, and they need billions of dollars to tease out the microbiome, to make a complete map of it, etc., etc. But this is work in vain. It's busy work. It's kind of like what Ray said. The Romans didn't really do anything except kept themselves busy. Keeping records and like started wars, but whatever progress the Roman Empire did was occurred on the periphery. It's not, and despite the presence of the Romans. So I don't see any progress coming out of the microbiome work. And actually, there's the American Association of the microbiome is across the street from me, and they have this nice building. They have these elaborate conferences every once in a while with giveaways and whatnot, and it's all doctors, right? And I read some of their brochures. It's basically just like they're trying to complicate things. It's like these expensive tests, stool tests, that will give you a map of your microbiome, and then they'll give you. They also do a genetic test, and then they'll find out if the microbiome that you have is actually optimal for your genome. And if it's not, then they have these recommendations, basically, of how to supplement with specific pro and prebiotics to raise the count of specific bacteria. But there's no evidence that you can actually manipulate the microbiome to that minute detail. And there's also no evidence that manipulating it that way is actually beneficial. But that's what medicine likes. It likes to complicate things and to the reductionist approach, because you're guaranteed if matter is infinitely divisible, which means that with every layer you're adding so much complexity, you're going to have to ask for a lot more money from the government or the taxpayer, and then your career is insured. They don't like people who think bottom up, people who actually move from specific to the more general, because God forbid you cure a disease and then you're going to kill the one of the many geese that lay the golden eggs. And that's something that medicine does not like. But multiple studies have shown that even people, but the many animal studies, but even people with sterile guts are actually extremely resilient to dying in the hospital from things like MRSA infection, which is very common, or from sepsis, right? Or from this cytokine storm, which is what the COVID-19 people are usually dying from when they get this acute exacerbation. So by mistake, people who had their colons sterilized because they were undergoing abdominal surgery, they usually use the antibiotic neomycin. And I think they take like 1 gram a day for like the 3 days before the surgery. And then the day of the surgery, they take a hefty dose of penicillin or amoxicillin. I'm blanking out. But anyways, that's the protocol. And these people basically, I think there's only like 1 or 2 cases of these people who have ever died, even during surgery or complications after the surgery and whatnot. They turn out to be remarkably resilient. Of course, their colon gets repopulated within a few days after the antibiotics are withdrawn. But while they are with sterile guts, they seem to be almost invincible. You have to hit them with a hammer on the head. And even then it's not clear if something will happen to the hammer or the head.
So then where does this stigma come from? Do you think it's like Danny, you were saying that some of the antibiotics, like you don't just recommend them willy-nilly, obviously, but you think some of them are possibly more dangerous than others? Is the dose a factor here? What do you guys think about maybe there's a lot of ideas about antibiotic resistance. Is that maybe skewing the perception?
At least from my back and forth with Ray, he said doctors tend to prescribe like massive doses of antibiotics. So he did say that was harmful. And then I know Georgie could probably speak to this better than I could, but some of the new antibiotics are like synthesized in odd ways. And I don't know, like the macrolides, the penicillins, the tetracyclines there's so much information on them, and they have a historical safety record. And then the depletion of the bacteria that make the vitamin K, I think that's also a problem. So using vitamin K when a person's taking antibiotics. And then one other thing I just want to add, and Georgia could speak to this better than I could, but I think because Ray flips a lot of things on its head, so like estrogen is not the female hormone, serotonin is not the happy hormone, nitric oxide is not something you want to increase for vasodilation, like a good pump. And at least one of the articles I think we talked about on the podcast was saying that the commensal bacteria were good because they produce nitric oxide. And so you always have to like read between the lines on these things and say like, okay, well, if somebody like Ray Pete is right about this stuff, then you don't want that bacteria because you don't want the increase in nitric oxide.
Nitric oxide, yeah. And the serotonin. Yeah, some of them recommend precisely because of their serotonin promoting effects. And I think some of the new ones, speaking of antibiotics, maybe some of the stigma comes that some of them actually are dangerous to the point of killing people. The fluoroquinolones, levoquin is a very famous one. Ciprofloxacin is another one. The most commonly discussed side effect is that they can actually damage your cartilage. They also make you increase sensitivity to light, so that they have phototoxicity. But what is not as rarely mentioned, I think now they actually started to add a black box warning, is that they can prolong the QT interval. So you can basically die from sudden cardiac arrest, just like that. Now people are dropping potentially from the vaccines, but this antibiotic in high doses, which is what doctors are, willing to prescribe, as Ray said, can actually kill people and has killed people. And only now, I think medicine is starting to recognize the risks of some of the newer ones, because the ultimate clinical trial, as I mentioned earlier, is us. So you need about 20 years of a drug being on the open market before you have a good idea of basically its dose response, of the side effects, ones that are being called that are rare, turns out that are not rare when you get a bigger population. So the only antibiotics that pass this test are the ones that he mentioned, the penicillin family, the tetracyclines and the macrolides. And now newer studies are showing that basically using quinones, powerful quinones, such as methylene blue or other quinones, actually has an antibiotic effect that the bacteria cannot develop resistance to. They simply kill the bacteria by generating a lot of reactive oxygen species. If you can get these quinones down to the gut, because in general, you absorb them in the upper portion of the GI tract and then get to your bloodstream. So you need non-absorbable quinones basically in order to get them to the colon. And for those antibiotics, for those types that are being developed right now, unless the bacteria mutates into a completely different life form, there should not be any resistance for them. They simply can't. It's a physical thing. It's basically, it's like, burning an ant like with a magnifying glass. I mean, I don't know how the ant must evolve in order to be resistant to that, right? So that's really kind of like how the quinones kill the bacteria if they can get to the GI tract. So this gives me an idea that maybe cascara, actually taken in the form of the bark, is a good idea, because the emodin, which is the main factor, the main beneficial factor in cascara, in the bark is in the form of a glycoside. So basically it does not get absorbed in the GI tract and has to get to the colon, where the bacteria there breaks the emodin down into its free form, right? And in the process, actually, not only it improves motility, but I think it's the emodin that is killing a large portion of the bacteria, and that's what produces, to a great degree, the laxative effect that is associated with cascara. Now, of course, it has anti-inflammatory effects and whatnot, but I think it has a decent antibiotic effect as well, because recent studies that I've seen on the new class of antibiotics being proposed based on quinones cite specifically the cascara and saying that, just its anti-inflammatory effect cannot fully explain the profound laxative effect it has in most people. There must be an antibiotic effect as well, because when they test stool samples from people who are chronically using cascara, they have a greatly decreased population of all of the bacteria types that are typically in the colon.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that's there's a lot going on there, but I guess for the audience, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, but from my perspective, the mechanism there is that bacteria essentially have antigens around them. So this can be lipopolysaccharide, or I think there's another one, Georgi, that activates TLR2. I think it's like PDG or something. It's like a peptidoglycan. You might have heard of this.
Any fragment of a bacterial wall, if it ends up into your bloodstream, is going to trigger any of the family of the TLR receptors. But in general, just the white blood cells will recognize it as a foreign object. In fact, when you're under stress and your mitochondria starts spilling into your bloodstream from all of these ruptured cells, that is actually interpreted. The body reacts to it the same way as if you had endotoxin in the blood, and it triggers the exact same inflammatory cascade. So basically, when you feed the bacteria in your gut with resistant starches or whatever makes it to the gut undigested, basically their turnover rate increases, and the bacteria that dies and breaks down all of these components, bacterial components, they have a decent chance of ending up in your bloodstream to getting absorbed, and you basically have the equivalent of a low-grade bacterial infection. At least that's how the body reacts to it. It's the fever response. Since 1930, I think LPS, lipopolysaccharide endotoxin, is the standard in animal studies to trigger fever on demand, even minute amounts of it. But then they've also managed to do it also with extracts from fecal matter, and basically, like, if you inject, so it's not, of course, like, people say, well, if you inject like fecal matter into the body, it's expected that you'll get sick. But what component of it is that causes this? Turns out that it's basically the bacterial breakdown products that are in there that are causing this fever response. So any bacteria that ends up in your bloodstream, your body treats it as non-benign. So any talk about benign bacteria, first of all, has to be predicated by the disclaimer saying that we're talking strictly in the gut. If that bacteria makes it into your bloodstream, you're in big trouble. If you inject yourself with lactobacillus in your bloodstream, you're in big trouble, right? So, but even in the gut, basically, if you're feeding that bacteria and promoting its growth, right, the breakdown, especially of the gram-negative one, but now they're finding even the gram-positive bacteria, which don't have endotoxin as part of their as a component of their wall. Even they're capable of activating. That's probably the component you mentioned. Even they're capable of activating the TLR family receptors, and that triggers essentially the same reaction as if you have a real bacterial infection.
Yeah, that is what I was trying to get at, because it looks like, just for the audience, the TLR's toll-like receptors, and these exist in the intestine, and essentially they are sensing these antigens from bacteria. And I guess previously I had thought that it was only triggered by this one lipopolysaccharide, which is also known as endotoxin. But apparently there's another one, which then basically indicates that all bacteria have inflammatory antigens on them, and all of them are essentially creating inflammation in the gut, regardless of gram-positive, negative, good or bad, or if they're in probiotics, or how much you pay for them, or whatever qualifiers there are about these bacteria. It seems like all of them are capable of activating these receptors in the downstream inflammatory cascade, which involves, like you guys were saying, nitric oxide, histamine, serotonin.
Yeah, that recent study about the antibiotics basically stopping the growth of the pancreatic and liver cancers, no matter what selected strain of bacteria they inoculated the mice colons with. I think, to me, that's a pretty conclusive evidence, because they used gram-positive bacteria as well. And I think one of the strains was lactobacillus, which they specifically picked because they said everybody's supplementing with these things. Let's test what they do. Just as nefarious as far as cancer is concerned as the, I think C. difficile is what the common pathogen that they use as an example of a bad bacteria, because it's also resistant, very difficult to treat with antibiotics, very thick wall. So yeah, and also, by the way, the toll-like receptors, they're not only expressed in the GI tract, they're expressed everywhere. And another recent study, which you may have seen in the forum, is that they're actually now saying that they may be responsible for asthma attacks. So asthma attack, and in general, struggling to catch your breath or having trouble breathing, may actually be a sign of endotoxin presorption, because your lungs and your the tracheas apparently also express the TLR receptors. And if this is in the bloodstream, if these components are in the bloodstream and activating those receptors, then you're causing localized inflammation in those tissues as well.
Can I just throw out one thing? I don't think anybody here is advocating like a bacteria-free intestine, because it's basically not possible to do. I think we're just talking about the benefits of decreasing the bacteria in the intestine if somebody has a symptom or something like that, because this often gets turned into that in the comments sections of these types of videos.
Yeah, I was gonna add in that little disclaimer, if you will, that even if in the lab maybe germ-free mice are super mice, they're invincible. That's not particularly realistic, and even if it was worth it to maintain long term. So I guess the takeaway is not that you want a sterile gut. It's just that people probably aren't walking around with bacterial undergrowths or sterile guts. They're probably walking around with the complete opposite. That's actually a good sort of segue, because Danny, I wanted to ask you about this whole vitamin D debate that's going on, because obviously vitamin D is heavily involved in the immune system and in keeping the bacteria everywhere, but especially in the intestine sort of in check. So apparently there are people that think that vitamin D is either not a vitamin or it's not good, and I'm not here to say one way or the other, but I know that you guys both have some thoughts on that. So let's get into that a little bit.
Well, that idea seems a lot less popular than it used to be, since like biggest person promoting that idea has backtracked on it. And now apparently completely agrees with what Georgi and I have been saying. And of course, Ray Pete have been saying for 2 years. I don't even know where you want to start with it. I could just start with an anecdote. Like when I was on carnivore, I had I think it's called hypersomnolence. I basically have insomnia till like at 2 or 3 or 4 a.m. And then I'd sleep basically all day and sometimes wake up at 1 p.m. or 2 p.m. And if sometimes my landlord would come over and like wake me up at like 11 p.m. and they'd be like, "What the hell? Are you sleeping right now? Like, what are you doing?" And I felt like I had taken sleeping pills. Like I could not, even if I had woken up, I'd be so drowsy that I'd have to like go back to bed like immediately after. So anyways, when I started supplementing with vitamin D while on carnivore, it caused me to start waking up at like 8 or 9 p.m. like naturally. And the energy, like the mood improvements, like the sexual function improvements were so obvious to me. Because at that point, I had been on carnivore for like 2 years, and the meat and water style carnivore. And so, and this is so long ago. This was like in 2008 or 9 or something. And at that point, I was like, man, vitamin D is really helpful. So that was kind of like my foundation of experiencing vitamin D and how it solved like multiple problems for me really quickly. And then another part of that is getting into Ray Peat's work and understanding like vitamin D or the cholecalciferol, its effects on prolactin, its effects on parathyroid hormone, effects on cortisol, et cetera, et cetera. And so I just gained more appreciation for it over time. And so when this, it's like kind of the Morley Robbins clique, like talking about how it's not useful, it's not a vitamin, it's a hormone, as if that matters, you know, and talking about how it's toxic or whatever. I did feel compelled, like normally I don't think I would have made a big fuss about it, but I did feel compelled to push back on it because I was hearing some of the same ridiculous arguments over and over again. And so last year I wrote a long article on my Substack covering a lot of the things, but it's almost like redundant to talk about it these days because I don't think it's as popular. And a lot of people behind the scenes told me that had promoted not taking it or that it was toxic, all tell me now that they take it. So I don't know where you want to go with it, but in general,
I didn't know that. I had just seen on Twitter some of the back and forths I think you had with maybe someone on Instagram who I guess some people
and end with a B or a burn.
Yes, it would be that person. And I'm not, I've never spoken with them, and I don't want to say bad things about it. It's just that was where I heard a lot of the counter arguments coming from, and I knew that you guys at least wanted to have some kind of a debate. And I think you guys might have recorded one, but it was very one-sided the whole way. It just like it didn't really seem that there was a leg to really stand on the counter argument, because the counter argument is essentially like, well, there's like a lot of vitamin D metabolites, and it's like, yeah.
that debate was a complete shit show. It was so one, I thought it was Kate Deering, it was me, it was Georgie, and it was Matt. But I thought Kate was actually anti, and I was surprised when we went on the podcast that she was more pro. And so I did feel bad. I didn't want to gang up on Matt, but before the podcast, I was like, and Georgie can attest to this, I was like, Matt, this is basically 3-on-1. Are you okay with this? And he was like, yeah, like that's not a problem. It's just a friendly conversation. And so he didn't bring much to the table in that conversation, but Jim Stevenson and Morley Robbins have a little bit more well thought out ideas. But again, like Georgie and I have interacted with Jim a little bit, and he seems a little bit off his rocker. But and then I don't know if you're aware, but Matt has completely reversed his stance on this, and so now he says all the same things that Georgie and I have been saying, that it's important, it's critical to get it above 40 nanograms per milliliter or something to suppress parathyroid hormone. There's a Ginn paper that talks about that, and so he was the largest promoter of that idea, and so now he's backtracked, and now it's just Morley Robbins and boomer extraordinaire Jim Stevenson like yelling at a closet on Facebook about how toxic vitamin D is. So to me, the debate is completely over.
Yeah, but I think they also fail to make the distinction between the calcitriol, which is the activated form, and the cholecalciferol, which is the supplementary form. And another argument they keep making is that, well, they make the argument that calcitriol is apparently bad, which I mostly agree with. And then they're saying, well, but cholecalciferol is the precursor. So obviously, if you're taking this precursor, you're going to be raising the levels of calcitriol, which is the downstream hormone. And that's not the case. And multiple people have made similar arguments about pregnenolone raising cortisol, or pregnenolone raising estrogen, or progesterone raising cortisol, aldosterone, estrogen, because technically they are precursors of all these hormones. But if you look at the actual studies demonstrating the exact opposite effects, not that many for pregnenolone, because I don't know, I guess medicine gave up on it back in the 1940s when they had all of their great new glucocorticoids come to market. But with progesterone, there are multiple studies showing first it acts as a antagonist at the glucocorticoid receptor, but also inhibits directly the synthesis of cortisol. by working on that system of enzymes, 11 beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase 1 and 2. So if anything, taking progesterone actually should lower cortisol, and there's an actual study showing that basically a 100 milligram oral dosage of progesterone dropped blood cortisol levels by about 40% in both men and women. It was a human study. But even that is not enough to convince these people that basically if you take a precursor, it's not as simple as immediately the precursor will go into that end hormone, and then that, we know that's bad, so taking the precursor must also be bad. That seems to be the argument that I'm hearing from most of the anti-vitamin D crowd. They don't talk so much about cholecalciferol. They're saying, oh, it's an inactive thing. It cannot activate the vitamin D receptor. Not true. Multiple studies have shown that it can't, right? Oh, it can raise calcitriol. Sure, but it doesn't, right? Also, what's the other argument they're saying? Like, oh, it can interfere with your absorption of magnesium. I actually don't know of any study like that. So ultimately, the arguments that are there are either sort of like abstract, that you cannot really argue with them. They're saying, it's given that this is a precursor. You cannot convince me, no matter what studies you show me, you cannot convince me that taking a precursor will not ultimately raise the end hormone. And I cannot argue with that, right? That's not an argument that can be won because the evidence that you present, they say it's, they have a theory, and since the theory is abstract and true, you cannot argue with it.
They always use bread analogies to like get their point across. And there was actually a funny response Ray said to somebody, and he's like, flour and water are precursors to bread, but they do not in themselves make bread.
Make bread, yeah, exactly.
This has become a moot point, but this is another one of those things that you're having a debate with somebody, and the proper kind of decent thing to do is to steel man their argument so you know where they're coming from. And I never got the sense that the anti-vitamin D crowd even understood the counter argument. And so that was always kind of a frustrating part about communicating with them. It was just they repeating the same thing over and over again.
That's why I kind of like the fact that I say it's not a vitamin, it's a steroid, because when they get to the discussion of steroids, then I say, very good. So what do steroids do? What receptors do you think vitamin D activates? And then they'll go, well, it activates the VDR, vitamin D receptor. Like, yeah, but not only. And then there are these multiple studies showing that vitamin D can actually activate a thyroid receptor. So it acts as a surrogate for thyroid. It shows that it can actually block the cortisol at the receptor. So it acts as an anti-cortisol agent. It shows that you can actually block the estrogen receptor alpha, so it acts as an anti-estrogen. So all of these things, I think that's why they don't want to talk about this, is because once you point out all of these beneficial effects that even they admit are there, right? Nobody wants excessive cortisol. Nobody wants, except maybe a doctor. Nobody wants excessive estrogen. Nobody wants low thyroid, right? But that crowd that is anti-vitamin D, they still tend to be pro-metabolic. So if you point out these effects of vitamin D, which seem to be healthful, then it kind of invalidates most of the argument.
Yeah, that would be a question mark of what they are pro-metabolic, or what that even means these days. Like, it almost doesn't mean it means pro-metabolic these days. Kind of means like you eat carbs. Like, that's basically like the extent of it. Yeah. So it's hard.
And you don't fast basically. Like, I think they've gotten to the point, because initially I had a lot of arguments with people saying, well, when I skip a few meals, my metabolism raises and I feel great, right? But then some of them bought these respiratory quotient devices. And they actually, I think one of them went to a metabolic ward because it was a competitive athlete, just to test. And he himself got convinced that even skipping one meal basically lowers the metabolic rate by about 15%. And the problem is that even after overfeeding afterwards, right? I think he was doing the warrior diet, like basically you don't eat during the day. And then after, 8 p.m. or something, then you can eat as much as you want between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m., right? And he found out that overfeeding basically does not restore his metabolic rate back to normal. It took several days of normal feeding to actually get back to the normal metabolism they had before, which was already low, right? So little by little, people are realizing that skipping meals, it's in general not a good idea unless you have a digestive problem. The only time animals in nature will skip food is when they actually are really, really sick, to the point where digesting the food will produce, because it always does, will produce metabolites that will actually threaten their health more than the benefit that the food will provide. But even then, basically, if the animal gets to the point of not eating voluntarily, the situation is pretty bad. And the same seems to be true in humans. And I think it's silly to actually do this on purpose. And then little by little, I think these fads are starting to fall apart. I don't know of that many people that are now promoting paleo, except for commercials and foods like that. But that's the last industry to go. Once you see these things promoted on the late night infomercials, then it's become really a sleazy thing that basically the pill pushers and selling it to old people that don't know any better. But as far as mainstream medicine is concerned, even now the big pro-fasting caloric restriction metabolic centers such as University of California, San Francisco is probably the most well-known one. The guy who runs the entire department there's a recent study which I also have on the forum. He said that he himself was an intermittent faster and low carber. He said he recommends neither to any of his patients anymore because his own studies show that they lost rapidly lean muscle mass, which is what Ray has always been saying will happen if you fast. He says, yes, you will lose fat as well, but first you will lose the muscle because it breaks down so much more easily than the fat, and also because the body prefers the glucose. So if you don't give the body the glucose, cortisol will rise and it will preferentially destroy your muscles before it does other things as well. So this study confirmed it, and the guy said, yeah, we, as biased doctors are to us, we fully admit that sarcopenia, which is the loss of muscle mass, is a very bad sign, and no diet that actually leads to that should ever be recommended as like on a day-to-day basis.
So that's this is definitely something that we wanted to talk about because I guess the ideas of carbohydrate restriction and calorie restriction in general are really promoted because people look at fat loss as like this holy grail of health. And that's not to say that you don't want to be lean, ideally, with good body composition, but it seems like people are prioritizing fat loss over health and are willing to do things like skip meals and try to reduce their appetite and suffer sleep quality and other things that we would consider to be signs of good health for fat loss. So I don't think anyone would deny that, yeah, if you don't eat, you're going to lose weight. If you eat half the amount of food, you're going to lose weight. But I kind of want to shift this paradigm and think about things as, how can we best maintain our health that also leads us to that good body composition, that leanness. And, maybe it's not like a cut per se, but it's sort of a pattern of metabolism that would lead you there. How do you guys see that? What maybe dietary, maybe otherwise lifestyle things would go into achieving that good body composition without, needlessly adding in stress and sacrificing your quality of life otherwise?
A couple of very interesting studies came out recently over the last maybe 2 or 3 years. One, which I think at the core of all these problems is the mantra calories in equals calories out, right? So basically the mantra of every doctor or health guru has always been eat less, move more, because that's really how you change that equation, quote unquote, in your favor. So there have been all these arguments made that people in the past were leaner, which is without a doubt true. I mean, if you look at the stats that were being kept, because they ate less and moved more. However, recent studies have debunked that. So people did not they actually moved less unless they're in hard physical labor. They moved less and they didn't eat less unless they were really, really poor. All right, this light is really killing me.
Danny, you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, I'll just throw out an anecdote. I was talking to somebody in LA, and they weren't very familiar with the content that Georgie and I do on my YouTube channel. But they were like, somebody told me you could help me lose weight. And I was like, that's not really, I don't really tell people like to talk to me if you want to lose weight. But we kept chatting and we were talking about metabolism, and they had cold hands and cold feet. And they had like kind of like a battery of low thyroid symptoms. So we did start talking about thyroid. And long story short, I didn't talk to them for about probably like, 3 or 4 months. And then when I got back on the phone with them, they're like, okay, so I got some Sinoplus and Sinomel, which are like the thyroid hormones T3 and T4. And they're like, I've been taking that, my hands and feet are warmer. I've been losing about, like a pound a week. And I just had some questions for you about blah, blah, blah. And it was just funny how how fast they glazed, went past that they were losing a pound a week. And then also their face looked like so much leaner than the last time I had seen them. They clearly were, telling the truth, And so I don't know. I don't think many people talk to me because they specifically want to lose weight. They tend to have kind of devastating health problems. And I always look at it like, I guess, like a symptom. There's a paper by, it's like a French name that starts with an M. And the paper, the guy is hypothesizing that the middle-aged weight gain that most people experience in their 30s or 40s is a mild version of Cushing's disease.
Yeah.
And so it's like, why try to approach this through food alone or restricting calories, which are both likely these days to promote stress, instead of, I don't know, adopting like a metabolic point of view or a bioenergetic point of view and trying to tackle the actual metabolic problems the person has. And so that's always how I look at it. And then, and again, most of the time the person's digestion is a mess or stuff like that. So those are always like these big macro issues that I'm always talking about with people. And then like having some Adonis physique or something. I know lots of guys are very attracted to that, but for what it's worth, I've talked to lots of actors, lots of bodybuilders that were like having devastating symptoms and stuff. So it's, I guess I'm trying to say I always approach symptoms first and then kind of everything else second.
Yeah, so in that line of thought, that another recent study came out which showed that, okay, so why are some people naturally lean and others are gaining weight as they age, right? Because some people, even through advancing age, they stay naturally lean. And it turns out, of course, the doctors initially said, oh, because they probably ate less and they moved more. Turns out it's the exact opposite. They actually ate more and moved less. And the one other distinguishing characteristics that they found is that they had a much higher basal metabolic rate and a much higher levels of T3. So this to me immediately should reclassify obesity or in general being overweight as an endocrine problem. And to which, just as the study that Danny mentioned, that somebody said, a doctor said, well, this is basically the Cushing phenotype, right? You're not exactly to the point where you're like the lemon with sticks model, which is what the Cushing people are. You're extremely thin limbs, and then basically look like a lemon, like the central body obesity, right? But they're getting there, right? And in some extremely people, basically in the extreme forms of obesity, you actually are starting to see people that look, indistinguishable from a person with Cushing syndrome. So basically, what does that mean? What should we do? Well, just as Danny said, you shouldn't be restricting anything really. You shouldn't be restricting the diet, the calories, but especially carbs, because if you do that, you will raise cortisol even more. So if cortisol is the pathogenesis here, then nothing that promotes cortisol should be attempted, or at least should not be done on a chronic basis. Guess what? Skipping meals will do it. Restricting carbs will do it. Eating too much protein will do it. So then what should we do? Okay, well, raise the metabolic rate. If the T3 in obese and overweight people is low, then we should be raising it, right? We can start by avoiding anti-metabolic foods because those play a role. But at some point, if the T3 is really low to the point of actually causing accumulation of weight, even at normal caloric intake, then you have to take something that restores your metabolic rate back to normal. And speaking of the mantra, no pain nor gain, calories in versus calories out. There was a study based on the show The Biggest Loser, how aptly named. Basically, these people that were part of the show, they went through these extreme dietary regimens and exercise and whatnot. And only a few of them actually managed to hit the weight that really was what the show wanted to show, right? Behind the scenes, apparently these people were being pumped full of drugs like beta agonists that basically act like adrenaline. All of these like caffeine, ephedrine, they were given all of these like pro-metabolic interventions, sometimes without their consent. Yeah. And basically what happens is that even the ones who managed to hit the weight target, when they stopped the study, they found out that invariably, without a single exception, every single one of them not only regained the weight that they used to have before the show, they actually exceeded it. And now they're really in a predicament because they're saying, I'm eating half of what I used to eat before, and I'm actually more obese now. How is this possible? Well, study that I think Ray keeps quoting on the podcast, basically these women that were put on a really low calorie diet, like 800 calories a day, to lose weight. Yeah, they did lose the weight, but guess what? After that, they better stay on a 600 calorie diet a day, or they rapidly regained their weight, even on the 800 calorie diet that initially helped them lose it. They destroyed their metabolic rate. They destroyed their thyroid. And I don't know if the study actually looked at giving them thyroid, but if anything, it should be a warning to this extreme dieting and exercise culture that is being promoted on everybody, because that's the only way to naturally lose weight. It turns out that people who are not lean, there is a good reason for it. It's usually related to stress. But since the body, you should always remind people, your body is not trying to kill you. It's doing these things for a reason. The suboptimal, basically the adaptive purpose of the gaining of the weight is that on average, heavier people have higher metabolic rate. So that's basically the body's suboptimal way. If you cannot build muscle, I might as well build a little bit of fat. First, it's going to keep core temperature higher, which is what the body prefers. And so it's like an insulator. It's like you're turning into a seal. Even though you're not living in the Arctic, your core temperature is low enough that the body actually considers a threat. So you'll put on some extra fat around the internal organs to keep your core temperature higher. And also, even though fat is less preferable metabolically speaking than muscle, it's still better than being hypothyroid and lean. So, and that's what they call now these days the obesity paradox. How come people with obesity tend to fare better survival-wise in COVID-19, emergency room situations? How come people with obesity tend to fare better in cancer cases? Like, how come people with obesity tend to fare better with dementia or Parkinson's disease? So these sporadic things keep coming up. Now, of course, they're not in optimal health, right? But they fare dramatically better than the people who are staying lean by force. I think that's really the key message here. If you're exerting yourself in order to look good and stay lean, that means you have a health problem and you should not be continuing this because you're exacerbating the situation. So you should be treating your problem as an endocrine problem, potentially, work with an endocrinologist, because even as inept and, clueless as they are, if they run a thyroid panel, chances are they'll discover, at least one of these problems, that you basically have low thyroid hormone or your TSH is higher than optimal. Recently, they lowered the range. I think there's a rumor that they're going to do it again, because now they're recognizing that TSH over 2 is already way too high. Now the current range, I think, extends like 3.5 or 3.6. Is that one?
4.5 usually.
4.5.
Yeah, I've
okay.
seen them go up to even 5. And people will say, oh, my thyroid's like totally good, and their TSH is 5, yeah. And they might be like losing hair or extremely irritable or anything else. So I mean that's another entire conversation. I didn't cut you off.
There's an editorial recently published in the American Journal of Endocrinology arguing that the TSH range should be lower again, because historically they're saying if you look at the TSH when it was measured back in the 50s and the 60s, it was very rarely above 2. And then they don't give the reason for it, but clearly if that was healthy and people had lower rates of all these chronic diseases, then at the very least we should be honoring that range back then, because of course the doctor who's writing the editorial, he's not doing it out of care for the people, because he's an endocrinologist. Immediately means tens of millions of more patients for them if they lower the TSH, the normal, the upper limit of normal. If they lower it, that is immediately will make tens of millions of people immediately hypothyroid by definition. But I think it's a step in the right direction, even though it's for corrupt reasons. It will basically draw more attention to the importance that the thyroid gland plays not only in metabolism, but in health in general. And if we have a lot more people starting to take thyroid, and then we see rates of chronic disease decline without anything else changing, I think this should be, well, maybe I shouldn't be so optimistic. To me, it will be, I would expect medicine to take note and say, hold on, maybe there's a correlation between metabolic rate and disease. So far, of course, they're sticking to the genetic paradigm, but I don't lose hope that at some point this will change, because it's not working. They keep doubling down on all of these stupid genetic ideas. Nothing has been cured so far. At some point, people will just stop going to the doctor, and at that point, they'll make it mandatory.
In Georgie's scenario, they would probably be prescribed thyroxine, which would probably make them feel even worse over time as well.
It's something that we've talked about, because for anyone who doesn't understand, the thyroxine is the T4, which is largely inactive, and then the T3 is typically what is associated with these metabolic effects, the pro-metabolic effects. But T4 can also be converted into reverse T3, and that enzyme that catalyzes that is typically upregulated by stress and by not having enough liver glycogen, because most of that conversion happens in the liver. So if you're dealing with a problem that's not central in the thyroid, but could be in peripheral tissues, giving yourself more of the precursor could actually make things worse, because you're not getting the active form. Is that right from your guys' perspective?
Sounds right to me.
Yeah, I mean, most of the the thyroid gland produces mostly T4, a little bit T3, but that T4, about 80% of the conversion into T3 happens in the liver, right? But now they're saying 70% of Americans have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So automatically, if you're pumping these people full of T4, you're basically endangering them because they will not be optimally converting it into T3. Even because the liver is not functioning very well. Well, T4 cannot really go into any other pathway other than T3 or reverse T3. And guess what? They're gonna get it into reverse T3, which acts as an antagonist to T3. That's why it's called reverse T3, and it will actually lower the metabolic rate even further. But however, T4 does lower TSH. So you go to the endocrinologist, he or she will do the test, your TSH will be suppressed, they'll say, excellent, you're no longer hypothyroid, yet you're cold, you're feeling miserable, right? Your nails are brittle, your hair is falling out. I mean, all these things, all these symptoms of classic hypothyroidism, but the doctor says, no, I'm going to decrease your T4 dosage because I've made you hyperthyroid. I see these cases all the time. And unfortunately, for some reason, the doctors in most Western countries refuse to use T3 unless you're in danger of falling into a called myxedemic coma, which is really the extreme form of hypothyroidism. But even that should actually show people, because that's treated with T3 only, right? So if the extreme form of hypothyroidism is treatable only with T3, right? Or if you're resistant to T4, you can have the syndrome of T4 resistance, which really to me is you're converting too much into reverse T3. Then they'll give you pure T3, but small doses and only for a few days only. And invariably that resolves most of the hypothyroid symptoms. So to me, that should be evidence, or at least indication that you should be taking at least some T3. Even if the main prescription is T4, you should be taking at least some T3 because the T3 will help the liver convert T4 into more T3. And if you're only taking the T4, just as you mentioned, it is going to be, in most cases, problematic, especially the higher dosages, like 100 micrograms or more, which are becoming more and more common. Because I think now doctors and endocrinologists are starting to recognize that there is indeed an endocrine problem endemic in the population. They're pumping people full of, because the only thing they know is how to raise the dose, right? You go to a psychiatrist with depression, the regular dose Lexapro does not work, jack it up, right? Or add another drug. That's really the same. Endocrinologists operate the same way. They will increase your T4 up to 200 micrograms before they actually consider that something else might be, going wrong. And from what I understand, at least from people that have dealt with endocrinologists, most of them refuse to actually test reverse T3. They're saying that it's only high in people who are genetically predisposed to convert the T4 into reverse T3. In all the other people, it really does not matter. Well, when you actually do test it, if you've been on high dosage of T4, invariably comes back elevated. So yeah, it always at least a combination of T4 and T3. Probably no higher ratio than 4-1 in favor of the T4. Anything higher than that, and you'll run the risk of raising reverse T3 too much. Definitely never only T4. And then for some people who really experience severe symptoms and they cannot feel relief on the even high dosages of Sinopos, which is the combination, then I think doing maybe a week or two on T3 only, small doses on a regular basis, maybe four to 5 times a day, I think that will be warranted. And I'm pleased to report that some doctors apparently are now becoming open-minded enough to try it. Some of them are posting on the forum, and they've already chimed in on several threads saying that they don't want to argue with the patient, and if the patient is not improving, they now believe that it's their duty as the doctor to try something else. And for a hypothyroid person, that means trying pure T3.
In very rare cases, right?
Yeah. Very rare cases because the doctors are risking it, because T3, I think the indication, official one, is still only the myxedemic coma. So if the doctor prescribes T3, the pharmacy will fill the script. They can report it to the FDA, because if they don't see a diagnosis of myxedemic coma, clearly if the person is showing up and picking up the prescription themselves, they're not in a coma. And also they can report a doctor, but also the patient can actually, the patient does not improve. If they end up, God forbid, suing their doctor or somehow getting legally involved, actually they have a case and the doctor may lose the license. So the doctor is risking a lot by prescribing T3 off-label, so to speak. It is available in the States, but only for this extreme condition of hypothyroidism. But more and more doctors are realizing that T4 alone is not cutting it. In fact, it's making things worse. So they're finding ways to, somehow circumvent the rules and prescribe at least a little bit T3. Some people have tried the Armour thyroid. Doctors do know about it. And I've heard that even though Ray had been saying for years that they changed the formulation, and I think he said that they may have removed some of the thyroid hormones because people have told them that they don't react well to it anymore. I think Armour may be reading what people are saying online, but I think they've changed the formulation back to the original one, and now people are reporting better effects, and doctors are starting to prescribe it more. That's probably the only fully legal way to get at least some T3 in your prescription. The doctor says, "I'm going to give you a prescription for glandular," because if the synthetic T3 is only available for the comatose patients, unless your doctor is brave and open-minded enough and doesn't care about his or her license getting revoked.
I like I was doing tyronine for a while, which is Georgie's product for anybody that doesn't know. Now I like the Tyro Mix. I think the Tyro Mix, I prefer it a little more, but they've always been good for me, even though they are just research chemicals. But I'm taking them on my own volition, and I felt definitely some benefits from them. Just putting that out there.
There's a quote, I think it's like 1988 or something, and it says, "When in doubt, let the patient try thyroid." And so it's like, it's not, I think a lot of times when we're talking about thyroid, people equate it to some super lethal, dangerous drug or whatever, but I think it's more akin to like a natural food than it is like Lipitor. It wasn't like made in a lab yesterday for the first time and people are trying it. It has a long historical safety record. So if you know that going in, I think it makes the whole experience smoother. And if a person hits a road bump, sometimes that can be meaningful in terms of what they should do. Like they might have some deficiency of this or that, and they might explore it further. So taking thyroid and having a weird response to it in and of itself could be a metric, and they could use that to explore their situation further.
I think some of the bad rep the T3 or general thyroid got was associated with its usage as a weight loss tool, which again, this evidence is out there. Why are doctors not reading the old studies that showed the the thyroid therapy was all the rage back in the 40s and 50s?
Outdated, George.
Outdated, right? Yeah. But what happened is that I think the people who were taking it in conjunction, a lot of them are taking in conjunction with the drug DMP, dinitrophenol. And because that drug caused quite a few deaths because of overheating, because it does raise the metabolic rate, basically the T3 got tainted by association because many of these people were taking thyroid as well. And since then, I think it's got this culture of no. If you're taking T3, that's going to raise your temperature too much. It's going to make your bones brittle, or you lead to heart failure. But all of these things, if you look at them, like the case reports, first of all, there are no studies, actually only case reports. Invariably, the people who had these problems were not taking thyroid only. They were taking dinitrophenol, and if they were taking thyroid, the dosages were truly massive. Those were, clinically obese people, and they were taking the equivalents of 200 micrograms of T3 daily. Even for a very obese person, that is a very hefty dosage. I mean, a healthy young 12-year-old child will probably produce no more than 80 to 100 micrograms of T3 daily. So 200 micrograms of T3 is a lot, especially combined with those other thermogenic drugs. But the thyroid on its own, considering that historically we've been eating about a grain and a half to 2 grains daily from organ meats, from eating the fish head soups, the chicken and turkey neck, and in general, if you're eating glands, they're usually full of hormones because the T3 accumulates in the cell. So if you're eating natural healthy animals, you are ingesting a decent amount of thyroid hormone as well, in addition to the other steroids that are there. But one thing that is common amongst the livestock industry these days is that thyroid is not being used because it makes the animals lose weight. And they want the exact opposite. So they pump them full of estrogen, which is another indication that estrogen is not good.
And full of PUFA, right?
And full of PUFA. They call it metabolic efficiency, which is also a term used in human medicine as well. They want you to be metabolically as efficient as possible, which means that if you have to lower your metabolism tremendously so that even a tiny piece of food will actually get converted mostly into fat instead of being oxidized for energy. That is the goal. And don't forget, lower your heart rate. Heart rate in your 30s, apparently, to any doctor who I've ever talked to, except some of those that are on the forum now, heart rate in your 30s is basically an indication that you have a heart of steel. Nothing can perturb you. Nothing can move you. You will never develop cardiovascular disease. In reality, it's a sign of severe T3 deficiency.
Do you think that something I've always wondered, let's say you take, I guess, we could say either of them, T3 or T4 or both. Let's say you do it for a year. If you stop, do you think you would have less than you did in the first place? Is there any risk of that?
It depends to what level, basically, whether this dosage you took for yourself was over physiological or not. So if you are naturally hypothyroid, I don't think taking this would have suppressed you even more. If anything, it may even stimulate your thyroid to actually recover. And then when you stop it, you may actually end up producing more than you used to before. If you're naturally towards the hyperthyroid range, right, and you take this dosage, then you may suppress your endogenous production simply because of the negative feedback cycle. But I think it was the Brother Barnes studies that he did with multiple humans that show that suppression only starts to occur after about 3 days of sustained elevated temperatures and heart rate. Which is hard for people to do on a consistent basis, even if they pay attention to it. I mean, they should be doing it, but basically, even people who constantly take thyroid to raise temperature and heart rate, in order for them to cause significant suppression, temperature has to be 99 degrees or above for at least 72 hours sustained. And I think the heart rate has to be over 90 beats per minute in order to basically, and these things have to happen together before the thyroid decides that your metabolism is basically too high. I need to scale down my own production. So yeah, it really depends whether this dosage that you were taking for you it was normal or high or insufficient. If it was insufficient, I don't even think you will do any suppression, except your TSH, which always it's very sensitive to any kind of exogenous supplementation. But as far as your natural production of thyroid, I don't think it will affect it much if you are naturally hypothyroid to start with.
Yeah, I feel like that's a common, I know, Jack, this isn't necessarily your question, but that's like a really common thing on the internet. It's like, well, if I take thyroid, will that suppress my own natural production? And I think there's a misunderstanding that that's the point. You want to suppress your own natural production because that has become inflammatory, like the high TSH or the pituitary functioning at a higher rate. And taking thyroid will calm down the adrenals and allow a person to relax. And so I think when somebody's saying, well, don't take it because that will suppress your own production, they're clearly not understanding what's happening. And then again, you have to take kind of a bit. You have to take a 1 grain or 2 grains even to get into that state. And so I think that's the therapy.
What I want to add to this is that the TSH is not necessarily correlated with the amount you're producing. In fact, a marker of good health, just as in the gonadal function, is that where the LH and FSH, also pituitary hormones, is that you want these to be on the low end, right? But then you want your androgen production to be high, which speaks of high sensitivity to these pituitary hormones. Having a high TSH is a bad sign, right? Even if your thyroid production, basically if you're producing a lot of T4 and T3, but at the expense of really jacked up TSH, that is a bad sign. So in that case, you more certainly want to suppress your TSH. But as far as affecting the actual production of the gland, again, I'm referring to the Brother Brown studies, that only happens because that's what you care about. You want TSH suppressed, that we don't worry about that, but we don't want to suppress the production of the endogenous T4 and T3, and that only happens if the body determines by other symptoms, not TSH, and that shows you why endocrinology is largely fake science these days. By temperature and pulse, which the body cares about a lot more than it does for TSH, only then the body will actually downregulate the production at the thyroid level, independently of TSH, of the T4 and T3.
Do you guys see, do you think that there's a similar mechanism in place? Because what you're describing is really adding in a bioidentical supplement and then that sort of triggering your body to, it's a lowering of the stress. So that allows your body to sort of ramp up its own production. Do you guys see a similar mechanism like that in place for the youth steroids? So things like pregnenolone, progesterone, DHEA, because this is one thing, and pregnenolone is something that I've been a staunch advocate for over the past couple of months because I've just seen so many insane benefits, sleep, just cognition, relaxation, just general anti-stress things. And when I tell people that I take it and they're like, but you're just like a young guy, you shouldn't be doing like HRT like that, like without a doctor is a different thing, but just in general, like,
how dare you think for yourself?
yeah, there's that aspect of it as well. But is there a risk if you are supplementing with something like pregnenolone or progesterone? Are you going to shut down your body's natural production of those steroids?
Not pregnenolone and progesterone. DHEA possibly could if you take so much that it converts massively into estrogen, and an estrogen does have a suppressive effect. But for pregnenolone and progesterone, no. I mean, I know multiple people, and now we are starting to do steroid testing in hair and nails, and we have multiple results where basically people's pregnenolone and progesterone results are off the charts. They're really eating this like candy, and their androgen levels, basically, there's no sign of gonadal suppression. In fact, it's the opposite. Basically, some of them who were in the hypogonadal range have managed to restore, at least into the normal range, there are things like testosterone, dihydrotestosterone, or DHEA. But invariably, if you supplement, so there's no suppression. To what level, to what degree pregnenolone and progesterone will be successful as true hormone replacement therapy, a safe one, so to speak, also depends on thyroid. I've seen people be able to achieve the same effects with, let's say, 30 milligrams of pregnenolone if they take with just 5 micrograms of T3, then somebody compared to what they've been using months before without a T3, several hundred milligrams of pregnenolone, and still couldn't get quite to the point of what the little T3 allowed the pregnenolone to convert downstream and sort of fill in the steroid pathway. So the youth steroids always go hand in hand with T3. I think they should be used together with thyroid, but even if you use them on their own, so far I have not seen any studies or case studies or reports from people who are using them in massive doses. I repeat, massive doses, hundreds of milligrams daily. I have not received a single bad report. Only one actually, but it turned out that the product had silicon dioxide and it caused intestinal bleeding, which was unrelated to the actual pregnenolone inside. When the person switched to using a powder, those symptoms disappeared.
I think Georgie and I are about to play out a Twitter meme right now, but I also think if the vitamin D is too low, a person will become insensitive to the steroids or thyroid. And I've anecdotally, take it with a grain of salt, I've experienced that multiple times. So yeah.
Company of Netherlands filed a patent for combining the anabolic steroid nandrolone with 4,000 IUs of vitamin D, because the patent says they did multiple human studies and they found out they can use a lot less of nandrolone and achieve the exact same effects and cancel almost all of the side effects of nandrolone, which can be very, very estrogenic, very easily converts to estrogen because it's in the same group. It's an 18 carbon steroid. And they just 4,000 international units of vitamin D applied into the injection through which they were using nandrolone, completely canceled all of its side effects. So again, speaks to both the potentiation of the good part of the steroid and negation of a lot of the propensity for side effects. But again, even without the vitamin D, for specifically pregnenolone and progesterone, not so much DHEA, those two, I have never seen a study, a published case report, or an actual anecdotal report from a person where they managed to somehow cause damage to themselves using even massive amounts over extended periods of time.
That kind of leads me into something else I was wondering. As far as like, let's say someone's trying to decide between, I guess we'll say like Stress-non, Pansterone, or Progestine. What kind of deciding factors could go into like what you would think that would be better for each case of that?
I will try the pregnenolone first for both men and women.
Actually, let me make a stupid joke. I was going to say a person should not use any of those and just go straight to Shilajit.
Okay.
That's right.
We're talking about rats here. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. Bad joke.
I always tell people to preferably start with pregnenolone as the top level steroid, right? It's probably the safest to use. For progesterone, there's been some reports from males predominantly saying like it decreased either their libido or sensitivity down there, or basically made them too sleepy, which it's expected to do because it is a GABA agonist. It also opposes the stress, the excited toxic hormones such as cortisol and estrogen. For pregnenolone, basically, I think it's probably the best first option because you kind of give the body a chance to decide what it wants to convert it into. And even in high doses, several hundred milligrams daily, does not seem to have like the sort of like the sedating effects of progesterone. It can in some people, but that probably means they were deficient into that pathway, progesterone, allopregnanolone, like the sedative neurosteroids. and even those effects tend to level out after a few weeks of usage. So pregnenolone is probably the safest, and I know kids who taken it, and there have been no negative hormonal side effects.
And you would go with, so you're saying pregnenolone alone and not with DHEA?
Yes. So the DHEA I would add if there is actually, usually the person is over 35 and their DHEA has naturally started to decline. I would still try to pregnenolone first, see how much, because it is supposed to convert, maybe about, I think 7% is what the studies say. About 7% of the dosage you take is supposed to convert into DHEA, but that conversion process and further down the cascade, it declines with age, because the cofactor for many of the steroidogenic enzymes is NAD, which declines with age and with disease, right? And with poor diet. So another thing you can do is to hopefully, again, potentiate the effects is vitamin D, if we haven't beaten that horse enough, and or niacinamide. Basically is a precursor to NAD. So I would actually take preformed DHEA in people whose DHEA is already suboptimal after they've confirmed that taking pregnenolone is not sufficient to raise it to the normal range. And keep in mind the normal range, they changed the normal range with age as well. So what was normal? So your normal, you can be normal as a 60-year-old person. If you look at the absolute value compared to what the range was when you're in your 20s, that's still about an order of magnitude lower, right? So you want to raise it to the normal range when you're in your mid-20s, which is when DHEA tends to peak in both men and women. So older people for whom pregnenolone was insufficient to raise their DHEA.
Georgi, that's actually an interesting point I was having with one of my friends. Is like you're saying that the reference range has changed. It's like normal. They're more lenient with the ranges as you get older, but it's actually kind of counterintuitive because like it doesn't get healthier to have more estrogen, or it doesn't get healthier to have less thyroid if you're older, right? It's just more normal. And this is actually something that I see. There's I guess the opposite view of the bioenergetic view is kind of you guys have talked about like the rate of living theory. And I've seen people say like, well, like the longest lived people on the planet have like very high TSHs, like therefore like that must be like what leads us to longevity. And I'm like, no, I think you have it backwards. I think that if you're 110, like because you are so old that your thyroid has slowed down a lot, not that you are like you gained this longevity because your thyroid is slower, but it's the other way around.
It's called compensated hypothyroidism, and there is an analog to that. It's called compensated hypogonadism. So if you look at specifically for the males and actually the females as well. So for the females, their LH and FSH with menopause become very, very high, but their estradiol and progesterone in the blood are undetectable because most of the ones in the blood are coming from the ovaries. So there's ovarian failure, hypogonadism, right? So they're trying to compensate by outputting all of these massive amounts of pituitary hormones, but it's not enough to actually stimulate the ovaries because without thyroid and with filled up with PUFA and whatnot, they're not responding to the pituitary hormones. Same thing is seen in males, but they seem to be able to actually compensate. So in males, they're healthily aging, quote unquote, you will see high LH and FSH and normal levels of androgens. And when they actually really start to decline is when they reach the sort of the equivalent of the andropause. Is LH and FSH, just like the females are above range, but the levels of the androgens become undetectable, or at least below the quote unquote normal range, which again changes with age. You're declining, but they're defining this as normal. But again, if TSH is high, but the T3 is normal in these centenarians or super centenarians, that's still better response than very high TSH and low levels of thyroid in the blood and in the cells. And in fact, we're now confirming it again with our tests. There was a huge Chinese study that came out this year actually with over 200 women, and it confirmed everything that I has been saying. That basically they looked at they stratified them by age groups, and they found there was basically a indisputable and uninterrupted drop of T3 into the hairs of these 250 females, right? They also found out that there was an indisputable and uninterrupted rise in estradiol into the hair of these women. So automatically, consider that some of them were definitely menopausal, automatically this invalidates the discussion that menopause is a condition of estrogen deficiency. Another thing they confirm is that the progesterone levels in hair invariably and uninterruptedly decline with age. So in just one study, I mean, I guess it's still new and not many people are referencing, but just one study confirmed everything that Ray has been saying, that we basically, with age, our metabolic rate declines. And the levels of the protective steroids, the youth hormones, declines. Pregnenolone, progesterone drop, right? Estradiol rises. Even mainstream doctors will tell you that you don't want estradiol to be too high unless it's being balanced by something such as progesterone in females. In some countries, they actually have a progesterone to estradiol ratio, which they put on the report card, and it's between 200 and 500. Anything less than 200 in blood, blood test. I'm sorry, 100 to 500. And Ray has mentioned in a few of his articles that the ratio should be at least 100 in favor of progesterone. The US and most Western countries don't use that ratio officially. Some endocrinologists do, but in some other countries, especially Latin American ones, it is an official biomarker. So you can have normal estrogen, right? But because your progesterone levels are undetectable, you're considered in massive estrogen dominance in those countries, and they will treat you, right? They do recognize that this is a bad sign. While here, yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say, and there's the added fact that like the estradiol levels in the blood may not correlate to the tissue levels.
Precisely.
That's correct,
yes.
right? And
yes.
I think estrone sulfate tends to be a better blood biomarker that reflects your tissue levels of these estrogens.
It's the long-term reservoir of estrogen, because the sulfate form, just like the DHEA sulfate, they used to test on blood tests. They used to send you for the DHEA test only, but then they found out that those levels fluctuate too much. And also what they really want to see is, because DHEA is kind of like a measure of adrenal health, right? They found out that it's DHEA sulfate, which is the predominant form produced and pumped out by the adrenals, is actually a better biomarker of health. But it circulates in much higher amounts than the free DHEA. Same thing for the estrogens. Estrone sulfate, which is a precursor to estrone, which itself is a precursor to estradiol, it circulates in the blood in much higher amounts than any other estrogen, and it can be converted as needed into any other estrogen, right? So even now there is evidence that even though estradiol declines in the blood in menopausal women, if you measure the estrone sulfate, not only it isn't low, it's actually above the range. And you cannot be, even by mainstream medicine's definition, you cannot be low on estrogen if your estrone sulfate is high. So really, like the very least, the battery of tests that they're doing for all these patients needs to change to be more inclusive of the things that we know. Actually, we've known it for a long time, but to be more inclusive of now irrefutable evidence that it's the totality of estrogens that matters, not whether one is, because they'll say, oh, estrone sulfate may be high, but it's a very weak estrogen. It doesn't matter. It can convert in only two steps. Actually, one step to estrone, which is already an estrogen and active, and then in two steps. And by the way, that conversion from estrone sulfate to estradiol, it happens to be accelerated more in older people because they're in more reductive state. And estradiol is the fully reduced hormone. It has 2 hydroxyl groups, while estrone has only 1. So there's a propensity to actually convert more estrone sulfate into estrone and then into estradiol as we age. So we'll be more estrogenic as we're aging, which is what the studies seem to confirm.
So girls taking estrogen and synthetic progesterone isn't a good thing?
Most of the synthetic progesterone is actually not even progesterone. Just because something activates the progesterone receptor, there's at least 2 of them that they publish and acknowledge, but they're usually taking a progesterone that activates progesterone receptor alpha. Just because something activates that receptor, that does not absolve it of other effects that it may have on other receptors. And unbeknownst to most girls, actually even unbeknownst to most doctors, the vast majority of synthetic progestins are derivatives of nandrolone. Nandrolone, as I mentioned, is actually, its core is an 18 carbon core, which is the same family as the estrogens. Its name, if you look at the chemical name, contains the word estrane in it. So most of the synthetic progestins, and nandrolone is actually a synthetic progestin as well, most of synthetic progestins are actually androgenic. They do have some progestin effects, and they're also estrogenic. Multiple studies have already showed it. So essentially you're taking estradiol or ethinyl estradiol, which is one of the esters. So most of the contraceptive pills are actually a hefty dose of 2 different kinds of estrogens with a slight progestogenic effect. potentially androgenic is also a lot of women are starting to grow beards and mustache and whatnot and getting hairy bodies. That's a very common thing. If you look at the forums, if you type like birth control pill body hair, man, all these forums pop up from all over the world. People are complaining about it and wondering why. Well, most of these progestins are actually derivatives of an androgenic and estrogenic and progestinic anabolic steroid that's like, really not meant for human use.
It's like they're on a constant, and even the bodybuilders, when they're on the cycle, they get off cycle, to reset, but they're on a cycle constantly, like years and years and years, just cycling like a 19 Nor derivative.
Yeah, but at least the bodybuilders are wise enough to, when they're doing the pulse cycle, the PCT, they will go on an aromatase inhibitor. They understand that these steroids can be estrogenic. They know that, right? In fact, it's very, of course, they say estrogen is needed for muscle growth, but they recognize the risks at the very least and try to mitigate them. I don't know of any doctor who's basically has told a woman, well, I'm going to give her this birth control pill, but because it's so estrogenic, let me give her an aromatase inhibitor as well. I don't know of any such doctor, or an estrogen antagonist.
Well, that's one of the contraceptive effects of them, right? Like it's not really
contraceptive. Estrogen is actually prevents implantation, so it's actually an abortion pill. Really, you take it on a contraceptive and an abortion into one combined.
Yeah, no, I was actually having a conversation with a girl the other day, and we were talking about so-called contraceptives, and we look up the chemical name, and it's synonymous with Plan B. So it's like, how can that be a contraceptive if you can take it after the event has already happened and it still works? That means that it's essentially killing the fertilized egg. Is that right?
Absolutely. And that's one reason why initially the Catholic Church refused to endorse contraceptives, and now they've only started to endorse them. They still oppose them mostly on a religious basis, but the industry, the drug industry, realized that the Catholic Church ever gets wise of the fact that this is a combination of contraception and abortion pill into one. There'll be a huge public campaign against contraceptives sponsored by the Catholic Church, and in countries like Latin America and like other countries where the church is the Catholic faith is really strong, then this will decimate the sales. So that's actually probably the main reason why you start seeing the pharmaceutical industry now coming up with a combination pill, and in fact now they're switching almost entirely to a progestin only, like that Plan B. There are plans to actually make Plan B to be the normal contraceptive pill on a daily basis, just in a much lower dosage.
Yeah, that's what the girl she has a IUD, and it's essentially just a constant infusion of Plan B.
There you go.
She's like, I have sleeping problems. I'm like, I bet.
And it's not even like, even if you aren't against abortion, it's still so bad, like just for your health. So it's bad from all angles, and I guess maybe that's why it's promoted. But
RIP Analyze and Optimize YouTube channel.
we might have to throw in some bleeps in here. We might
disclaimers. Georgie said that, but he did not really say that. It was just his alter ego.
And
by the way, that drug, the Plan B, it's called Altrenogest. I don't know if that's the one you looked at.
I think it was like levonorgestrel, something like that.
Level norgestrel.
Yes. I think, and that is used as both an IUD contraceptive as well as a Plan B. So
if you look at the name, actually tells you that it's a derivative of nandrolone. The real name of nandrolone is 19-nortestosterone. So this is levonorgestrel. So the nor means there's a carbon atom removed. So it became from the androgen group, which is 19 carbon atoms, to the estrogen group, which is 18. So levonorgestrel is a very direct derivative of nandrolone. And they have another one which is also using for Plan B. They're calling it Altrenogest. And Altrenogest is almost like a twin brother of the infamous anabolic steroid Trenbolone, which they're using to turn bulls and cows in general into these massive muscular beasts because they want to sell more meat. So that's what they're giving women. And they're lying to them about the side effects, and they're saying this is a progesterone or acts just like progesterone. Nothing can be further from the truth, other than the agonism on that one specific receptor. I don't think these two classes of drugs have anything else in common with each other.
So correct me if I'm wrong here, but bioidentical progesterone, not synthetic progestins, which as we described are also estrogenic, but bioidentical progesterone, when administered, exogenously, can act as a true contraceptive, meaning that it prevents the fertilization of that egg, as opposed to essentially just poisoning it after the fact. Is that correct?
It has been used actually in the past, before they came up with the synthetic ones, as a contraceptive. Depends on the route of administration. I think intravaginally is probably what is going to work best. But about 100 milligrams, if they're dissolved in vitamin E, so which means they're absorbed well. If they're introduced vaginally, maybe about an hour before intercourse happens, I think that's a pretty, almost like 100% certain way to prevent pregnancy.
Yeah, those were the studies that I was reading. Obviously, hasn't been followed up on since the advent of these, better pharma, so-called contraceptives. But yeah, I think it was like in the 60s and 70s they were doing a good amount of research on whether it was like a subcutaneous injection, or I don't think they tried the oral route because there's problems with progesterone absorption in the gut. But I know Ray's ProGest-D, he recommends that you administer it like in the gums. So I don't know if that's a viable option. I'm just like, this is probably a video that we're going to do at some point and covering all this, but I want to, if like women are watching this, I want them to have like a safer option other than essentially just poisoning themselves.
He's recommended putting ProGest-D on a cervical cap.
Oh, okay. I never heard that.
Or rubbed on it vaginally because it's closer to the reproductive organs. Basically, you can do it orally too and in the gums, but I think the dosage will need to be much higher. Because the effective you're distributing has to go through pretty much the entire body and then reach the ovaries as well and the uterus. But if you do it vaginally, I think it preferentially kind of like moves up and targets the uterus and the ovaries. I know women who are actually using this on a daily basis, 100 milligrams progesterone applied vaginally, and actually it doesn't have to be on every day. It's as needed, if they're knowing activity will occur, but an hour before. They're applying it, and so far there's been no pregnancy. It's been done for years.
Yeah, no, I think it's very important that if we're able to sort of resurface these older studies that were done to give ladies a better option, because unfortunately the dialogue on this has moved to a very predictable manner, which is okay. Well, then why don't the guys go and sterilize themselves too, and then it's fine. And it's like, well, maybe neither of us should be poisoning each other, and we could try to come to a safe middle ground.
Yeah, they're trying to frame it as that yet again another group has to man up and take responsibility, right? I agree that it's way past. It's long overdue for women to stop poisoning themselves. But the solution to that is not let's switch now this over to the men, right? Like and poison them with, or actually irreversibly sterilize them with vasectomies and whatnot. The solution really should be push back against the medical industry, saying, what else can you offer me? Because what you're doing right now is just not cutting it. And, we're getting sicker. It's causing all of these other problems. And the solution should not be more drugs and more procedures, should be less.
Exactly. 100%. Danny, did you want to add anything to that, or?
No, I'm good.
Not touching that. Okay. So we have been on for, my goodness, I guess 2.5 hours, and then technical difficulties. So it's been more like 2. So I don't want to keep you guys forever. I did want to touch on one final thing, and you guys can, get through this as fast or as slow as you want. But we have talked a bit about receptors and the idea of membranes and such throughout this podcast. But at least in the older videos that you guys had released, you would often invoke terminology saying like so-called receptors or like so-called membranes. So what is your stance on that? Is the stance that these receptors don't actually exist and that it's just an effective model for studying these things? Do the receptors exist, or what is your stance as far as receptors and membranes go?
There certainly exist at least the receptors, but it doesn't mean that that's the unique and only way through which like a steroid molecule will manifest its effects, even though medicine says that it's got to be like a key and lock, right? And unless a receptor for something has been found, they refuse to acknowledge this thing can have endocrine effects. For example, Aspirin has been known to have anti-estrogenic, pro-progestogenic, pro-androgenic effects, but they're saying, the aspirin molecule doesn't act through any of these receptors. So either we have to admit there's a lot more than the receptors going on in terms of a molecule exerting its effects on a cell, or maybe say that the receptors are a lot more widely distributed in the cell than just these receptors that they call them the nuclear ones, right? So the molecule binds with a receptor in the cytosol and then moves towards the nucleus, where it starts to activate specific parts or silence specific parts of the DNA. That process happens for the steroid molecules, but now they're starting to talk about membrane progesterone receptors, membrane estrogen receptors. Then they're starting to talk about like non-localized receptors. So in other words, they're saying, okay, because they've done tests, they take a cell and they remove through the genetic engineering or manipulation, they remove that steroid receptor which they want to test. Let's say the glucocorticoid receptor, and then they create a culture of cells, and then they add an exogenous glucocorticoid, and they're still seeing downstream effects that are consistent with cortisol or glucocorticoid being present. Well, how does this happen? The cells should be insensitive to the glucocorticoid, yet they still are reacting to it. Well, I guess either you have to say, there's more receptors than we know about, or the molecule acts in other non-genomic ways, is what they call them. And I think it's a combination of both. So yeah, the receptors are there, but they're probably responsible for no more than 10 to 20% of what, let's say, cortisol or estrogen would do. Their non-genomic effects are actually much more important, specifically estrogen's ability to increase the cell's affinity for water. And as soon as the cell starts absorbing, increases the affinity for water, you'll start absorbing more water from the bloodstream. And then this expansion of the cell triggers a lot of the sort of like mitotic, cell division processes that are associated with cancer. They're also associated with wound healing and just tissue regeneration in general. But, in the absence of growth restricting mechanisms such as progesterone, pregnenolone or androgens or thyroid or vitamin D, in the absence of those mechanisms, then you basically get unchecked growth, which is cancer. So the non-genomic effects, in my experience, in my opinion, of steroids or any other molecule for that matter, account for the majority of their effects, not so much the specific binding of the receptor. Case probably the most direct evidence to that is that a study I recently posted on my blog is that the so-called triple negative breast cancer, which is supposed to be completely insensitive to any steroidal therapy, and that's why they're not prescribing any steroidal therapy such as anti-estrogens or aromatase inhibitors and whatnot, was actually, at least in the test that the study did, they were able to fully stop the growth of breast cancer, of this specific breast cancer, by administering an androgen, dihydrotestosterone. Well, this breast cancer, by definition, in the medical books, is hormone insensitive, not just to estrogen, to any other steroid, right? Yet they managed to stop it with one of the most potent endogenous androgen in the human body. Well, either there is a hidden androgen receptor that we don't know about, or there's a lot more to the dihydrotestosterone than its ability to act as an androgen. It's got a lot of other effects, right? And we know what they are. I mean, it inhibits the uptake of estrogen. It blocks the cortisol effect at the receptor level. Maybe inhibit the uptake of cortisol as well. Promotes the conversion of T4 into T3. Increases the association time of T3 with its own receptor. So it basically prolongs the effects of T3. Many good pro-metabolic beneficial effects that we know are associated with differentiation and away from growth. Yet medicine seems blind to these. They're there, they're published, right? But nobody is putting everything together into one picture and saying, okay, yes, we know DHT is an androgen, but it's not a misnomer, but that's probably maybe about 10% of what this molecule really is. And we need to talk about the other 90%. And it's not happening. If you talk to any endocrinologist, they'll tell you, no, DHT, prostate cancer. That's all I know about it. That's all that matters.
I agree with everything Georgi just said.
Thank you for this constructive comment.
Awesome. Well, yeah, Jack, if you had anything else to throw out there. I mean, we had questions from people from the audience, but we've already been going for too long. And maybe we could do another one of these at some point. But
yep.
Yeah, it was awesome having you guys on. Jack, was there anything else that you wanted to throw in, or?
No, that was it.
I think we
like
got to.
kind of took a while to put this together, but I think it was really worth it. And I really appreciate you guys coming on. I think we had a great discussion and definitely would be down to do it again.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, and I thank them. Well, before we were recording, and I want to thank them now in public, just for everything that they have brought to the table. Just endless amounts of content and just good energy in an often nihilistic world, nihilistic space. Even health is supposed to be something that brings us joy and purpose and fulfillment in life. And I feel like this crowd and these two folks in particular really understand that, and they've certainly changed how we view the world and how we view health. So can't thank them enough. It's truly great to have them on. And yeah,
I mean, like the influence you guys have had on our channel is immense. So you can thank these guys for.
Can you mention your Twitter like aliases and whatnot so people know about? I didn't know you guys post on Twitter, so I know.
Oh yeah. So so our we'll put it on the screen. So
Okay.
on Twitter, we are at Outdoctrination. So it's like indoctrination, but with an out. It's very
Good, very good one.
very clever on our end. But it's analyzed and optimized. You'll see the same logo and everything. And then let me shout out. So obviously Georgie
turned the table on you guys.
Yeah. Asking on my own show. But and Georgie obviously is the mastermind behind IdeaLabs Take or research with his substances as you please. I know I have done quite a bit of research with IdeaLabs products, and they're of the highest quality. And then I know Danny, you do consulting services on Patreon, and you've some own content of your own. So we'll put all that on the screen and in the description below. We're definitely follow both of you guys on Twitter. So I'll send out a tweet after this, and you'll see. Let everyone know that this happened. But yeah,
Awesome.
thanks so much for coming on, guys. I know it took a while, but definitely was worth it. Not a lot of fun.
Thanks for having us. Really.
Once the first step is made, the subsequent ones are usually easier.
Yeah. So yeah, hopefully we do more of them in the future.
All right.
That's good.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. See ya.